Hello, and thank you very much for joining this presentation, which looks at how decision-making measured under conditions of risk in childhood might predict the presence of important eating disorder symptoms in adolescence. I'm Dr. Amy Harrison. I'm an Associate Professor and Clinical Psychologist at University College London. I have no commercial relationships to disclose. In this talk, I'll explain to you why decision-making might be an important construct to look at in eating disorders and summarise what we know so far from cross-sectional work. I'll then share the findings of our longitudinal study and discuss some of the implications and future work. Some of the challenges that we're facing in our field are the eating disorders, which are serious psychological illnesses that high levels of social adversity, poor quality of life, significant care needs, and are associated with physical complications because of significant under and overweight, first have their onset typically in adolescence. The clinical and public health implications of this are that if we could understand a little bit better how these eating disorder symptoms first emerge and some of the factors that might predict their onset, we might then be able to inform and improve our prevention programs and early intervention. And we do think that decision-making is an important construct for eating disorders. It's something that's talked about in contemporary models of eating disorders, which suggests that differences in the way that people make decisions in response to repetitive or rewarding stimuli or punishing or aversive stimuli may be factors that perpetuate eating disorders. We know that people with eating disorders have high levels of anxiety. Those with restricting forms of illness seem to be very compulsive, show inflexible cognition and behaviour, and have high levels of perfectionism. And those with binge eating forms of eating disorder have high levels of impulsivity. So there are some clear differences in the sorts of responses that people are demonstrating under conditions of risk and punishment. And the emerging field of computational psychiatry actually suggests that decision-making differences might underpin psychiatric disorders more broadly. Some of the ways that these differences in decision-making might affect people's lives are summarised in these clinical examples. The first person says, "I can't make decisions at the best of times. I'm scared to choose the wrong option and I get overwhelmed weighing up all the possibilities. Sometimes I just want others to do it for me, but I don't like that because I want to be in control. If I get something wrong, I feel terrible and I want to avoid doing it again. I never take risks and I hate doing anything vaguely risky." So we can really see here the very risk-averse, cautious, low reward sensitivity profile associated with this person with an eating disorder. In the second example, the person talks about losing control of their behaviour, particularly when something unexpected happens. All of their plans go out the window and they take big risks. They're scared of getting things wrong like the first person, but once the impulsivity kicks in, they're predictably impulsive. Others might think that's quite fun, but they experience that as a nightmare to cope with. Again, we can see some of the differences in decision-making that this person's experiencing in the response to rewarding stimuli. What we know so far from self-report data are that people indeed with restricting forms of eating disorder do have this high level of punishment sensitivity alongside low levels of reward sensitivity. So these individuals are driven by wanting to avoid aversive stimuli and aversive experiences, and they're not really driven by rewards. Conversely, people with binge purge eating disorders, although they have that high punishment sensitivity and share that high anxiety, they also experience and report high reward sensitivity. And we see similar profiles in recovered populations. And we don't think that these features change very much even after 40 sessions of intensive psychological therapy. From experimental tasks, we know that people with eating disorders don't do very well on the Iowa gambling task. In fact, they may perform quite similarly to people that have acquired brain injuries, and they have difficulties adjusting their responses in the faces of rewarding and punishing signals. On the game of dice task, we see similar we find similar data. People, for example, with binge eating disorder make more risky decisions, and they have real difficulties using the feedback that they get from the task advantageously. However, these important findings are also limited by the fact that these studies are cross-sectional in nature. So we don't know very much about what the person was like before the illness. We don't know how much severe underweight and acute and chronic starvation might confound these findings and perhaps be a scar and influence performance in recovered populations. These data are also largely derived from small clinical samples, and therefore we don't know very much about the majority really of people with eating disorders who are out there in the community who don't get into clinical services, and those in the community with significant eating disorder symptoms. So this project brought together my specialist expertise in eating disorders alongside the expertise of Professor Irini Fleury, who's a professor of developmental psychology and epidemiologist, Dr. Marta Francesconi, who's an epidemiologist and clinical psychologist. And we combined our skill sets together to try and better understand how differences in decision making in childhood might help us to understand the presence of eating disorder symptoms measured later in adolescence. We did this using, we explored this research question, using data from the Millennium Cohort Study. And we wanted to understand whether differences in decision-making measured experimentally at age 11 using the Cambridge Gambling Task might help us to understand the presence of eating disorder symptoms measured later at age 14, and how risk profiles of these symptoms might how emerging symptoms might cluster together to form risk profiles associated with different decision-making skills. We hypothesized that the risk-taking, quality of decision-making, deliberation time, risk adjustment, and delay aversion derived variables from the Cambridge Gambling Task measured at age 11 would predict the onset of important symptoms of eating disorders measured at age 14. The Millennium Cohort Study is the UK's 4th longitudinal birth cohort study and involved over 18,000 children who were born in the year 2000, being followed up over the last 20 years over 7 different assessment points. And the advantage of this particular data set is that it represents all 4 UK countries and stratified the data collection to represent minority, ethnic and deprived communities who are often underrepresented in these sorts of cohort studies. In this project, we used data from sweeps 5 and 6 when the children were aged 11 and 14, and this gave us a final analytic sample of 11,303 boys and girls. There aren't clinical assessments of eating disorders in the Millennium Cohort Study, but there are some really useful questions that help us to address the presence of important eating disorder symptoms. And these include body dissatisfaction, the intention to lose weight, dietary restriction, significant under or overweight, and excessive exercise used to influence body weight or shape. The Cambridge Gambling Task was developed to assess decision-making and risk-taking outside a learning context. In this task, the participant is presented with a row of 10 boxes across the top of a computer screen, and some are red and some are blue. And the ratio of those red and blue boxes varies between stages, but there will always be one box that contains a yellow token. Participants must use the red and blue buttons at the bottom of the screen to choose the box colour where they think that yellow token might be hidden. Participants start with 100 points and they select a proportion of these points to bet on their decision. A circle in the centre of the screen displays the current bet value, and this will either incrementally increase or decrease depending on the task variant selected. Participants press this button when it shows the proportion of the score that they would like to bet, and these points are then added to or taken away from their total score depending on their decision and where that token is actually hidden. And there are 6 different possible outcome variables that can be derived from this task, And we used the risk-taking, quality of decision-making, deliberation time, risk adjustment, and delay aversion variables. We didn't use the overall proportion bet because it has a very high correlation with risk-taking and is perhaps measuring the same sort of thing. In our models, we adjusted them for important confounders such as gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. We found that body dissatisfaction was not widely present, interestingly, at age 14, but that around half of the sample was showing an intention to restrict their dietary intake. They were actively restricting their nutritional intake and excessively exercising to influence their shape and weight. A small proportion of the sample were underweight, and around a third of the sample were overweight. We found that those with better quality decision making were 34% less likely to show an intention to lose weight and 34% less likely to be overweight. Those with higher risk taking were 58% more likely to report dietary restriction and 46% more likely to report excessive exercise. Those with higher risk adjustment was associated with a 47% increased risk of underweight, and better quality of decision making was associated with a 46% lower risk of overweight. So what do these data mean? Well, some key symptoms of eating disorders, such as body dissatisfaction, interestingly, weren't present at age 14. But some decision-making differences measured at age 11 were associated with the intention to lose weight, dietary restriction, overweight, and the use of driven exercise to influence shape and weight measured at age 14. We then conducted latent class analysis to explore how these eating disorder symptoms might cluster together. And the best fit for the data was a two-class solution. This actually reflected not the emergence of perhaps a restricting form of eating disorder or kind of more under-controlled form of eating disorder, but actually two risk profiles. One was a low-risk group and the other was a high-risk group. The low-risk group were the participants who had minimal body dissatisfaction, low intention to lose weight and dietary restriction, a moderate use of exercise, and they were more likely to have weight within the normal weight category based on the UK 90 weight classification. The at-risk group, however, had more body dissatisfaction, more intention to lose weight. They used a more dietary restriction and greater excessive exercise, and they were actually more likely to be overweight. So the sorts of decisions that they were making around their eating behavior and their exercise were perhaps not actually having the intended consequences of losing weight, given that they were had the desire to do so. We found that less risk-taking, poorer quality of decision-making, longer deliberation time, and less risk adjustment and more internalizing symptoms were present in that at-risk group. And then we looked at how the high and low risk groups' decision-making skills changed over time. And we found that the at-risk group actually improved less than lower risk peers in deliberation time and risk adjustment scores. So the take-home message here is that some aspects of decision-making, deliberation time and risk adjustment, seem to show perhaps a different developmental trajectory between the ages of 11 and 14 in those at risk of eating disorders, which perhaps underpins the neurodevelopmental nature of eating disorders. In future work, using the data from the participants collected at age 17, which is becoming available this year, we're now going to explore how responses on the Cambridge Gambling Task at age 11 and 14 then influence the presence of eating disorder symptoms at age 17. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation. I look forward to reading and interacting with you around your questions and your thoughts about these data.